Welcome and thank you for joining us on Heywood Healthbeat. I'm Mike Ellis, your host, and today we're going to go on a long and arduous journey on discussing those things about health that make us more successful, more happy, more healthy. Today I'm joined by Tim Sweeney. Tim is a coordinator for our men's program. He's a facilitator for the men's program in Athol, Fitchburg, and Leominster. Tim is also the facilitator for Quitters Win, a smoking cessation project. He is unbelievably active in the community and is one of the greatest resources for suicide prevention in our community. And today we're going to focus on suicide prevention and intervention in our community. Tim, thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here, and it's always nice to see you, and it's nice to make a connection with our community as well about something as important and sadly not talked of, that being the topic of suicide prevention. I had the opportunity recently to provide QPR training to the entire senior class at a local high school. And I was really grateful for a chance to talk with people and to begin a conversation about something that shouldn't have the place in our culture that it has. I think if suicide didn't have silence and stigma and shame working for it, it wouldn't be a thing. Suicide would be almost non-existent in our culture and in our communities today, if not for the silence, the stigma, and the shame. And if we can have conversations that eliminate those influences, we're going to make a lasting difference and save lots of suffering for lots of people across our community and the country.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking today about suicide prevention because it is a significant problem in our culture and our society globally. Which, we're putting more money, time, and effort into trying to be more mindful and aware of the crisis that people may be involved in and experiencing that may lead them up to thinking about suicide, and numbers keep going up. Can you tell me a little bit from your perspective, what's the problem out there when we talk about the numbers? What's really happening in our communities?
So it's staggering to me that when you look at the mortality rate to cancers, all sorts of cancers, the mortality rate, the rate of people who actually succumb to that disease is declining across every sort of cancer because medical technology, we're learning more, we're knowing more, we're preventing more. But when you look at suicidality, the numbers are growing year after year while other mortality rates decline. And it really is, it goes back again to that silence, that stigma, that shame, that we don't talk about it. And in anonymous surveys, I believe it's over 40% of adults acknowledge that they've seriously contemplated a suicidal act, that they've had a suicidal crisis of a sort. And I'm thinking if 40% of the people admitted that the real rates are
much
probably
higher.
double that. And yet, we don't talk about it. And it's one of those situations that, because we don't talk about it, it gets worse. We live in such a connected world, right? We've got, cell phones and laptops and tablets and all this connectivity. And yet, in some ways, I think those devices can serve to isolate us so that we don't even really connect with the person sitting beside us sometimes. And I think that isolation, that whole idea that I'm the only one that feels this way or nobody else understands, or just the absence of a meaningful glance and a pat on the shoulder from somebody who knows me and says, "Hey, how's it going, big guy? You doing all right?" That kind of connection is really sadly missing in our culture today.
For many people it is.
For a lot of folks. Yeah.
In 2016, there were about 45,000 suicides in our country. Almost 6,000 suicides attributed to young people between the age of 15 and 24. 6,000 kids. You talked about stats, and we'll throw some stats out just so people understand the enormity of the problem. 10th leading cause of death among all causes.
Right.
Second leading cause of death for college students and young people. Are you kidding me?
So in nightly news, we hear about homicide, which is the 16th leading cause of death as opposed to suicide, which is the 10th. Suicide never makes the nightly news unless it's a celebrity.
Yep.
And then for a few weeks, everybody pays attention. And then we stop talking about it again.
So why do you think people don't pay attention? Why do you think people aren't engaged in, actively trying to support somebody who might be in a suicidal crisis?
I think there's a lot of myths and misperceptions out there. Like, if I talk to Mike because I think he might be feeling suicidal, he's going to be mad at me, or he's going to think I'm insulting him. You know, if I noticed that you had some red spots on your cheek and on your hand, I'd say, hey, buddy, these might be measles. Why don't we go see the nurse? If I saw something that concerned me, that led me to believe that maybe you had a health problem of one sort or another, I'd say, hey, my friend, I care about you. Why don't we go have that checked out? But when it's suicide, again, we've been trained, and I think really effectively trained, that we don't talk about that. But you know, I'm encouraged, 50 years ago, or maybe not even that long ago, people whispered and only spoke in hushed tones about cancer. Now look where we've come, right? Cancer has its own days. All different kinds of cancers have their ribbons and their days and their celebrations and their fundraising efforts. And I hope that we can change the culture so that this other entirely preventable tragedy can be averted.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important message for our viewers to hear, is that we all have a part to play in that, that it can't be left up to our doctors, it can't be left up to our mental health professionals, that as parents, as friends, as colleagues, as associates, as brothers and sisters, sons and daughters, we have a role to play in ebbing the tide of suicide actions and crisis.
And it reminds me of, like, as far as homeland security, right? We live in a different culture today as far as homeland security goes. If you see an unattended piece of luggage at an airport, you don't just walk by that. You alert somebody. See something, say something. See something, say something. That's become just part of our conversation on a very regular basis. If I see somebody who's exhibiting some of the signs of a person in crisis, I need to say something. And I guess one of the messages we need to make sure people understand is it's okay not to be okay.
Yeah.
Everybody's not okay sometime.
Yeah.
And if we're not okay and we get the help we need, that's the other thing that blew my mind, was an overwhelming majority of people who experience a suicidal crisis, if they get the right help, they never have that crisis again. And I had a skewed perception because I worked in a population with chronically mentally ill individuals. So I saw people who cycled in and out of suicidal episodes over and over and over again. So my perception, my view was, people who are suicidal keep being suicidal, and for a vast majority of people who experience a suicidal crisis, that is not the norm.
Yeah.
It really, for a lot of folks, it's a temporary and, most importantly, preventable set of circumstances that when people get the right intervention, they get the right support, it never occurs again, and so much suffering is averted.
Tim, we do a lot in terms of training for suicide intervention and prevention. One of the things we talk about is the correlation of warning signs and risk factors. Just like in heart disease, there are certain warning signs and risk factors that would increase the likelihood of somebody maybe having a cardiac event, and then those warning signs that tell us that somebody's in the midst of a cardiac event. Let's talk a little bit about risk factors so that our viewers know and understand what are the kinds of things they should look for, and then some of the warning signs. What are some risk factors for suicide? Now, I want to remind our viewers that risk factors does not mean simply because you have a risk factor, somebody is suicidal, but it increases the likelihood, and as the number of risk factors increase, so too there's the possibility that they may have a suicidal crisis. So let's talk about risk factors.
So an overwhelming majority of people who attempt suicide are male. There's a gender issue. That's not to say there aren't attempts in completed suicides among females, but there's definitely a prevalence of men when you look at suicide statistics.
And we're talking about completed suicide. So men complete at a rate 4 times greater than women. But just to clarify, our female members of our society tend to have a higher rate of attempts.
More attempts among females and more completed suicides among males.
Why is that?
So When you think about, it brings into the conversation the whole matter of lethality of means and the access to means. Men are more likely to have access to and to use firearms. Firearms significantly increases the likelihood that a suicide attempt is going to become a completed suicide,
Right.
as opposed to other means.
So lethality and means are certainly one indicator. Why else do you think men tend to have a higher rate of completions?
Well, this kind of ties into the work that I do in the community for menders. I think our culture has, again, perhaps more for men than women, made it uncomfortable for us to express our emotions. I think men culturally have been trained to not express emotionally meaningful content, to man up or to
Play through the pain.
Yeah, and if I have feelings and I don't have an opportunity in a comfortable, safe place for me to express them, then I turn them inward. I can, which can have negative health consequences. I develop an ulcer, a stress disorder, heart disease. All sorts of medical concerns are connected to stress. And if I don't have a way to express myself that's healthy and safe and accepted by our community, by our culture, then I stuff it, or I might try to drown it, or cloud it, or avoid it through some other less healthy coping skill.
So we know that gender certainly is one of the risk factors, but simply because somebody is a man does not mean they're at risk for suicide.
No.
What are some other risk factors?
Well, a history of suicide in the family. Unfortunately, a suicide in the family or in the close social circle increases the likelihood that a person in crisis might see suicide as a viable option. And so there is sort of almost a contagion effect that we have to be aware of. When a community experiences a suicide, we need to make sure that we keep the wagons in a circle and provide ongoing support for people.
Wicked important.
In that there's sort of a ripple effect. I think that's the name of a movie, the Kevin Hines story. The name of that movie is The Ripple Effect, and that's part of what he's talking about, is that there is this sort of ongoing increase of the likelihood of a suicidal act because of a suicide.
Yep, absolutely, and that's been, pretty rigorously studied and quantified. So we know that being around or having experienced a suicide in your close personal life by an associate, a friend, a family member, increases the risk, but again, doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is suicidal. Any others that stand out to you?
Sure. So a history of depression, and then there
or other
mental illnesses, mood disorders in particular. There's also situational things. Somebody who's just had a relationship breakup, somebody who's just been terminated from a place of employment, somebody who's just had to withdraw from school or been flunked out or dropped out of school. There's a lot, significant transitions in a person's life, especially negative, transitions with a negative connotation to them. It's easy for somebody, again, to have sort of a skewed perception. In the same way, I always thought that suicidal people were chronically suicidal because that's who I worked with. When I'm in a crisis, I've lost my job or I've, going through a divorce, in my little view of the world, I can feel overwhelmed and really not be accurately perceiving the world around me.
I think that's a huge statement, that you can be overwhelmed and not accurately perceiving really what's going on around you. And depression and mental illness does that, right? It clouds our judgment,
Absolutely.
It clouds our vision. It makes things seem different than what they are or could be, right?
And substance abuse
Huge risk factor.
compounds that,
Yep.
in a significant way, and really makes an unfortunate situation even worse and harder to accurately understand.
Along with some of those other risk factors, we have gender, we have military status, remember LGBTQ community, age.
Absolutely.
But you talked about the big five. First of all, gender. We know that has an effect and that there's a correlation just by fact that you're a guy. This idea of loss, significant loss. So, transition, moving to a nursing home and losing your house, losing your driver's license, going to jail,
Oh yeah,
loss of a
absolutely.
relationship, divorce, death, all of those. Although they are acute and not chronic, they're not long-term, it's difficult during that short period of time to go over. So excellent point. And, folks, I think that if you're hearing this and you have somebody close to you that may be experiencing any of these things, again, we don't want to send off, flares or put up flags, but they are a reason to be more focused, to be more attentive to those people. Chronic problems, I think, are easier to identify. These acute crises are much more difficult. You talked about substance abuse and mental illness, which plays a significant role in increasing the risk for suicide. So those are some of the risks. And then across all of them, Tim, you also talked about this idea of hopelessness, right? Just not being able to feel like you're ever going to get out of it, excuse your perception, excuse your vision of what's really happening, this idea of hopelessness. So those are risk factors. So what about warning signs? Warning signs are that somebody is in imminent danger, somebody's at imminent risk for suicide. What are some of the things we should be looking for?
So in the QPR trainings, and just the other day with the high school students, what it really boiled down to is we solicited what they thought the warning signs might be and compared it to what the PowerPoint presentation says the warning signs are. It's really a change. It's a change in employment status. It's a change in my connectedness with other people around me. When I start to withdraw, when I watch my social media feed and see, like, all of a sudden there's no poster in the daytime. He's posting at 2 a.m. and he's calling in sick for work. When there's a change in my connection with other people around me, that's a warning sign for a number of things, and certainly could be a warning sign for somebody who might be having a suicidal crisis. Certainly when somebody starts divesting themselves of valued possessions, somebody all of a sudden says, yeah, well, I don't really care about collecting these baseball cards anymore, and gives away something that's has a perceived value to that person, and they start offloading some of those treasured possessions. That should really alert us that something's going on here. There's been a change in the way my friend is feeling towards his possessions. Sometimes there's an uptick in substance use or alcohol use.
Yeah.
Or a recent relapse for somebody who's been in recovery from substance abuse.
That's important. And I think I'm just going to have you maybe expand upon that a little bit. You say an uptick. So we're talking about a change in the use. A change, just so that people understand. So they may be drinking more, they may be using illicit drugs, or increasing the amount of drugs they're using, having never done it before, starting.
Yeah, gambling recklessly. Just what sort of things show a lack of care, a lack of concern? Because somebody who's really thinking about ending their life, doesn't care about paying off their credit cards. Those bills might just stack up, and who cares?
Right.
If somebody really expects that they're not going to be here for the long term, what sort of things would they care less about? Interestingly, one of the sort of paradoxes is an overwhelming majority of people visit their primary care physician within a couple of weeks just before a suicide attempt. And that, to me, especially for a gentleman of a certain age, if I really was sure I was not going to be around long term, I wouldn't be going to see my doctor, especially for the deluxe over 50 physical exam that gentlemen are of an age, comprehensive exam. And I don't mean to be flippant about that, but why do you suppose somebody who really is intent on ending their life would bother to go to their healthcare provider a couple weeks before? And I think I know the answer. When I go to my healthcare provider, that's one place where I know people are going to ask me a bunch of uncomfortable questions that I don't want to ask, that I don't want to answer. And I think that the person in a suicidal crisis wants to have this conversation and has been trained not to talk about it. And I think if I go, if I'm really thinking in the back of my mind about ending my life, I make my appointment with my doctor, and I know as part of my annual physical, they're going to say, do you have any, do you feel any, do you fear you're in danger because of the relationship you're in? Do you wear your seatbelts all the time? Have you been feeling depressed lately? Tell me about how much you're drinking. They're going to ask me those questions that might give me a chance to begin the conversation.
Tim, I think that's such an important message, that people who are in crisis do want to talk about that crisis.
They want to talk about it.
And the things that stop them, again, are stigma, shame, silence, right? So we know that there's a reason why, even as a dad, as a husband, certain things are going on that you don't want to burden people with. It's a great observation. To give you the stats, about 40% of people who have attempted or completed suicide visit their doctor within a week.
Within the week
65% within a month, 90% within the year. So we know almost virtually everyone who have attempted or completed have seen their primary care docs within 12 months of that suicidal crisis. That's important. So one of the messages we can give to people, so I'm not a doctor, but one of the messages I can give to somebody who's in crisis is make sure you see your doctor regularly. Go see your doctor, because as you said, they're employing new strategies. They're doing new things to try to convince people to, talk about these types of crises they're having and to seek help and to refer them to help.
When I traveled abroad, this just occurred to me. I had the opportunity to speak to people who I did not know the language, whose language I did not know. And I had things I wanted to say to them, but I was not allowed to say them until an interpreter came and created that door from one of us to the other. And in some ways, that person who might be having a suicidal crisis wants to have a conversation and isn't allowed to because of the cultural pressures until somebody else opens that door and becomes that means of communication. It's so important for those of us who are not having a suicidal crisis to understand it is our duty to start the conversation. And sometimes that could be uncomfortable. Because again, as I said before, if I say, hey, Mike, you don't seem quite yourself lately, I'm worried about you. Have you been thinking about hurting yourself? You could be upset with me, but to be honest, Mike, I'd rather have a mad Mike than a dead Mike.
Right.
And when you think about it, I'd rather speak up and be wrong than shut up and be right. We can't, the risks of not acting, the risks of not speaking up, we just can't live with those possible outcomes. I'd rather tick you off and have you think, what do you think, I am nuts or something? People sometimes aren't able to verbalize that in a way that's comfortable, but at the end of the day, if you're alive, I win. Yeah. And we really have to think about what's hanging in the balance.
And that's just a really huge consideration. It is uncomfortable to talk to somebody. Yeah. It is uncomfortable, and it's uncomfortable because there's pain, there's emotions, there's fear and anxiety, and those are emotions that are uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to get to the position where you find out somebody's thinking of taking their life, but by God, we have to get there. We have to be uncomfortable. And so you talk about having the conversation. There's a 3-part strategy that we train and try to get people to employ, 3 steps. I'll qualify that by saying, the process is QPR. It's a nationally recognized evidence-based process. I like to call it CPR, but the American Red Cross and the Heart Association have already taken CPR because it's really not about question, persuade, refer. It's about conversation, persuade, refer. And you've mentioned conversation 3 or 4 times, having that conversation. How do you start a conversation with somebody? And what are the types of things you should or shouldn't say? I mean, you really shouldn't be asking about suicide, should you?
Well, they do want to talk about it. So it's, so one of my favorite question to, conversation, if I see somebody who really seems to be at risk, my favorite question is, hey, have you ever felt like you just wanted to go to sleep and not wake up? And I always make sure I nod when I ask the question, because I want to make it easy for you to say, well, yeah, Tim, as a matter of fact, I've been feeling pretty crappy lately. I want to make it easy for you to say yes. Not if yes is in fact the honest answer. So I like that question because it doesn't use the word suicide. It doesn't use the word kill yourself. But have you ever wished, nod, that you could just fall asleep and not wake up?
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand when you start this conversation, it's not an interrogation, right? And we don't necessarily want to go immediately to that place where everyone's uncomfortable. Maybe that person isn't quite ready in the conversation to say, yeah, I'm struggling. So, alluding to it at first, eventually you do have to ask the question specifically whether or not they are thinking about taking their life or completing suicide. But doing it
If I'm not,
subtly at the beginning.
If I'm not sure, if it's really early on in the conversation,
Yep.
I mean, that's my
Yeah, I think it's a great suggestion.
that's my last question. Here's where, and based on your answer, we'll see what happens next. But are you okay?
Yeah,
It's like
what's going on?
It's the easiest thing in the world to say, are you okay? What's going on? How you doing today? And then be willing to just be still. If you are quiet long enough, someone's going to fill in the space and they're going to tell you what's going on. They're going to tell you, I'm kind of okay.
I have another favorite on-air personality, similar to me, Judge Judy. And Judge Judy says, God gives you 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you listen
Shut up and
twice
listen.
as much as you talk. And I think that's a really important thing you just said is you have to listen. And listening isn't just about hearing. Listening is processing and understanding and getting to that point of empathy so that you know what people are going through so that you can respond in a way that, is appropriate. So listening, hearing what they're saying, adding those and asking those prodding questions to elicit more information, and then sitting back and just listening. Because people who are in crisis want to talk.
Yeah.
People who are in crisis want to tell someone.
And to listen to them, to not try to solve their problems. One of the things is, I felt that way too, and you know what you need to do? You need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's not what somebody in a suicidal crisis needs. They need a sympathetic, empathetic presence. They need you to listen and say, wow, that must feel overwhelming. Do you have somebody you can talk to about that? Or tell me more about that. And just sit and listen and let them offload. Remember, they've been wanting to have this conversation and they haven't had an interpreter who'd let them talk. So listen, don't solve their problems, agree with them. This feels overwhelming. And then maybe move it towards what sort of supports do you have. And depending on how serious the situation is, then of course the R in QPR is refer. Excuse me. To whom do we refer? Where do we refer? What
We're going to get to that
help
in
these people?
half a second. The first step, though, is having the conversation, and that's probably the most difficult part of suicide intervention and prevention. It's probably the most difficult part of a relationship is having those serious, deep, and meaningful conversations, especially when somebody is suffering. So having the conversation and getting into our comfort zone of being able to do that.
Yeah, and being able, and I really think it's important to remember, they want to have this conversation, but you need to start it. If we push the play button, they've got things to say. We need to be the one to push the button, though, because they're not going to start the conversation themselves. The culture has trained us not to.
So you come across somebody, you have a conversation, and through that conversation you find out they're in crisis. Such a significant crisis that they need some kind of assistance, they need some kind of support, they need some kind of help. And it could be as serious as, considering suicide. What do you do then? What do you do then when somebody tells you that? I imagine, it's overwhelming for a lot of folks to hear that, like, crikey, what do I do?
Yeah, so depending on where you are, because I do a lot of QPR training in school settings, where are the safe places? Who are the safe people? Who are the resources that we have available in this building? Well, there's the school nurse, there's the guidance counselors, there's any adult teacher.
Adjustment counselors.
Yep.
Yep.
And if you're in in the community at large, then you may know where the nearest hospital is. An emergency room, they can access a screening where somebody can be seen by a qualified clinician and determine if they need further treatment and what sort of further treatment they need. And if you're traveling, if you're in the middle of Pawhuska, Oklahoma, and you find a guy standing on a bridge, there's always 911.
Right.
And there's the 800 suicide prevention phone number. I usually have the students program that into their phones while they're doing a QPR training, so that they have that suicide hotline number as well.
So getting them the help they need, using hotlines, calling 911 is an important step. But what do you do in between? So if I'm having a conversation with somebody about, a crisis they're in, I can refer them to a million different places, but how do I ensure that they're going to call that person? How do I know, how am I certain that they're going to go see their doctor or their mental health therapist?
So I either take them there myself, or I stay with them until help comes. Or once in a while, in one situation I can think of, I waited until their spouse showed up and the two of them agreed. We contracted verbally together that the two of them would proceed to the emergency room and be screened and seen by a professional. But sending somebody and hoping they'll take the next step, again, when we understand this person may have a skewed perception of what's really going on in their world right now. They may feel hopeless, and the idea of seeking help might be beyond them at that moment. I take that step for them. Is there somebody I can call for you? Who can help you in a situation like this? May I get in touch with them now? And I stay with them or agree with them to bring them to the services.
That's huge.
I don't send them. I bring them or wait until that connection's made, because I don't want to be the only person, right? If I'm the lifeline that's keeping you from your suicidal act, that puts you and I both at risk. We need to take this lifeline and make it a safety net, and get some other hands on deck.
So that's a great piece of advice. Enlist other people. If you find that your gut is right, your instinct is right, well, even if you don't find that, but your gut is telling you there's a problem, enlist the help of other people. And you mentioned here at the school, guidance counselors, adjustment counselors in the community. It could be your rabbi, your priest, a mental health therapist, a nurse, a doctor, an Indian chief. It really is about a team effort, right? And
whoever is their clan, their culture, their community.
And keeping them safe. I love the fact that you brought up the point that people who are in crisis, especially a mental health crisis, can't always see the benefit of doing certain things. They're hopeless. They feel like, well, I've tried it before, it hasn't worked. Or maybe they just aren't motivated, right? Depression is a demotivator. It keeps us from doing things. And sometimes we have to go that extra step. Sometimes we have to do a little bit more. So first rule of thumb that you mentioned is, you got to stay with them and bring them to, or ensure that they get to help. And that's a tough thing to do, to have that kind of tough love and say, we need to go to an ER, or we need to go to a crisis stabilization unit, or we need to go to your mental health therapist together right now, you and I. We're not going to wait till tomorrow. We're not going to wait till Friday to see whether or not this crisis has diminished. You're in crisis, and that causes me to be concerned. And then the second thing is, you call or enlist the help of others to do that. In the last case scenario, and you mentioned the wife and the kind of contract for safety, this promise to not hurt themselves until they get help. It's the least best option, but sometimes you have to do more. You have to do more with people who are depressed, and that's an important message that Tim just gave us, and I want to reiterate it. Sometimes you have to do more, and you're in it for the long haul. That means, by the way, if you're talking to somebody who's in crisis, don't expect to go to your next appointment 10 minutes from now. You're in it for the long haul. You're in it until that person gets to the next level of care. So why do you think people avoid calling 911?
Well, they might be afraid that it's going to show up in the police log. That may further embarrass them. Not that this is something, again, if you had measles, we'd get you treatment, but it may be something that makes people reluctant to engage 911. 911 may not be the most eloquent way to navigate this problem, but in a pinch, if I don't know where the local ER is, if I don't know where I can take them myself, then I need to dial 911.
Or they're unsafe, right? They're unsafe to not only themselves but you. putting them in a car might be dangerous. So calling 911 is an option. One of the things I want to tell folks, if you're in a situation and you have to call 911 for somebody who's experiencing a mental health crisis, there are things you can do. Tim just mentioned the fact that sometimes people are embarrassed, and folks that have a heart attack in their house are embarrassed when the police cars and ambulances and fire trucks come rolling up and there's a scene in front of their house, right? There's that embarrassment factor. And people don't like necessarily to call attention to themselves. Well, you can ask 911 when you call to please arrive without sirens and lights. Sometimes it's the fear of having to ride in the back of a police car. Well, you can ask specifically that people are transported by ambulance. You can ask for minimum restraints, and you can ask whether or not they will allow somebody who loves and cares for them and supports them to ride in the ambulance. So there are a lot of options that
Those are great.
Right.
Those are great pointers.
that keep us from those allowing those barriers to be put up for call 911. Sometimes 911 is the best option, but there are other things that are great options. So we talk about mental health crisis stabilization centers. There's one at 40 Spruce Street in Leominster. You can drive that person or bring that person right to the center. They'll have a mental health evaluation, Johnny on the spot, right then. And then those professionals can determine the next level of care. What are some other important, and you mentioned the suicide prevention hotlines. Hotlines work, ladies and gentlemen. Here's why hotlines work. We talked about being overwhelmed emotionally with the conversation you're having. Your loved one, it could be your kid or your spouse or your parents, are having this crisis that makes them think they want to take their life. And for us, that's emotionally anxiety causing, right? It's fear producing. A hotline can help us navigate that conversation as well. Either the person on the hotline, that 800 number, will take the phone and talk to the person directly, or they'll assist you when talking to that person. So it's a great backup resource. As we say, enlist a team. Hotline's a great resource as a team member for you to call upon to assist in that crisis. So we have hotlines, we have the ER, we have 911. What are some other resources that people could call on?
Well, because of the situation that I found myself in, getting the spouse or partner on board, they were nearby when we were able to summon them. They came and were able to assist. And there are, as you mentioned, there are clergy members. A person may have a therapist. They may have, if it's in a school, of course, they've got the school nurse, the counselors, and the staff that are there. But the key, when you think of the word illness, it begins with the letter I. The word wellness begins with the word we. And I think, who can you connect this person with? Who's a meaningful and safe person that's going to make this person feel okay? But if I'm the we, if I'm the person, I like you said, I need to be ready to clear the rest of my schedule because my day isn't going to go as I planned. And that reminds me of a day a year and a half ago when I headed off to work kind of grumbling because I didn't want to go to work. My wife was home because it was a Monday holiday for some people, but I had to go to work. And you also mentioned listening to your gut. That morning on the drive to work, my gut said that I should take this particular route to work instead of the regular route that I drive to work. For some reason, my gut said, go this way. It was cold, it was rainy, it was dark, it was early, and I was whining because I didn't want to go to work that day, and my wife and my kids were home, and I was really being a crybaby about it. And when my gut said, go this way, I said, okay. I try to listen to my gut when I can, and I drove to work. And I didn't think much about it until 20 minutes later when I drove upon the French King Bridge between Gill and Montague, Massachusetts. And in the dark, in the cold, in the rain, all alone, on the French King Bridge was a 25-year-old man in a gray, rain-drenched hoodie with his arms folded on the railing and his chin on his arms, staring straight down 140 feet to the Connecticut River. And you can't stop on the bridge because there's not room to. So I pulled off to the parking space at the end of the bridge, and I walked as quickly back there as I could. And as I walked there, I thought, I know what to do. I know QPR. I've been training people in QPR for a couple years, but I'll be honest with you, I used to be a CPR instructor, and I never got to use CPR. I never got to personally test it to see if it worked or not. I at one point trained CPR trainers, but in all the times I ever trained somebody to do CPR, and all the times I ever trained trainers to train other people to do CPR, I never used it. I don't know if it works. Well, as I walked towards that man that morning in the rain, I thought, I know what to do. I hope it works. And I remembered Q is ask a question or start a conversation. P is persuade them to see things differently, to wait, to reconsider. R is to refer. And I walked towards that person, and he didn't even turn toward me when I spoke from behind him, and I just said, "You okay?" Which sounds like a dumb question, because obviously he wasn't okay. If you ask a question you know the answer to, maybe that's a dumb question. But I asked a dumb question. I said, "You okay?" That's all I had to say. He said, "I'm fine." So I asked a dumb question, and he lied outright to me, because he obviously wasn't fine. And then I said, "You don't look fine to me, and I'm not going to leave this bridge without you." And then I didn't say much. I remember at one point saying, "You look really overwhelmed. It's getting kind of cold out here. Do you want to go sit someplace and have a coffee?" So maybe coffee is a magic word, but what really mattered was that I showed up and I showed care. A complete stranger stopped and said to him, "Are you okay?" And that was the beginning of the end of his crisis. By the end of the, we summoned his mate. The three of us agreed together that they would travel together to the emergency room where he was screened and got the services that he needed. And I went to work late that day. I was very wet and very late, and I didn't care about showing up late to work because I was in the right place at the right time, and I knew what to do about it. And that was life-changing for at least one man and his family. Well, and really life-changing for me too, because now I know beyond any shadow of a doubt that this really simple way of starting a conversation with somebody, again, I think he was waiting for me. He just didn't know it was me, and neither did I. I think he was waiting there hoping somebody would come along and let him start the conversation, let him talk about what was on his mind. And I really encourage people to take that, dare to take that first step and ask that question. When your gut says something's wrong with this picture, lean in, step in, show up, show care. A complete stranger saved this man's life by asking, "You okay?" It doesn't get any simpler than that. It doesn't get simpler than that.
It paints a great picture. And if folks were having difficulty understanding how important suicide intervention and prevention is, your story underscores the huge necessity for all of us to be engaged. Now, I know a little bit about the story, and I know a little bit about the background. Tell us where that man is today.
The man has recently had a child, and while protecting his privacy and allowing him his privacy for months after that event, we did correspond on a quite regular basis. He texted me a lot, and I've tried to let him go because he's not mine.
Right.
He's a stranger to me in some ways, and I want him to be able to be free to get on with his life, and he has. And he has a son, and it delights me to think about, when I drove by that morning, lots of cars drove across the bridge that morning, Mike. I remember at first it was frustrating to me, like, how did these people not see what was going on? Well, it was just beginning to get light. It was fairly dark. So maybe some people didn't see the man standing alone on a bridge in the rain, in the cold. But maybe, so we forgive them. But maybe some people saw the man standing alone in the dark, in the rain, in the cold, and didn't recognize that as a warning sign. And that's unfortunate. Those people need a QPR training. And maybe some people saw the situation, recognized that something was wrong, but they didn't know what to do about it. Those people need a QPR training too. I suppose it's possible that some people saw it, recognized it as a crisis situation and didn't care, but I don't think that's the norm. I think that would be the exception and not the rule. I think people, if I was having a cardiac crisis and I fell over clutching my chest and became unresponsive, I think most people in America know enough CPR to save me if I'm savable. And I'd like to believe that people would step up and try. I hope that someday we live in a world where as many people who know CPR know QPR, because quite frankly, we will save more lives with QPR than with CPR. Because if you perform perfect chest compressions and perform technically excellent CPR to a person having a cardiac crisis, there may be other complicating factors that make me unsavable, even with perfect CPR. But if you do QPR, there's an overwhelming likelihood that the person is going to respond favorably and is going to be saved because of that intervention. Because it really is, it's a momentary lack of hope that obscures a person's vision and allows them to see the end of their life as a viable option. It's a very momentary, potentially lethal lack of hope. And when you step into that situation, you change everything. And I can not only say that because I read it in a training manual, but I can say that because I stood in the rain with a stranger, and he lived to tell about it.
That's huge, Tim. That's huge. And it doesn't need to be said, but it should be. Thank you for being so in tune with folks around you and engaged as not only a mental health person, but a person in the community who cares. So thank you for that, and thank you for that important message to our viewers. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard a lot about QPR. QPR is available to you, to your families, to your businesses. If you're interested in getting trained on suicide intervention and prevention, you can contact Heywood Hospital. We'd be happy to set that training up. It's free training. We don't charge for that. Absolutely. In addition to QPR training, we have ASSIST training. ASSIST training is an 8-hour training specifically on suicide intervention and prevention. It's a great training. Mental health first aid training is a full day training as well on recognizing the signs and symptoms of mental illness and how to respond effectively and how to acknowledge or notice when somebody is in crisis. Training helps us perform better in terms of crisis. It gives us information and education, gives us the technical skills we need to be successful at these interventions. And you don't have to do it alone. Please know and understand that if you are experiencing somebody in crisis, that you can call in the troops to help you help that person. And that's what it's about, helping others. I want to also give you a couple hotline numbers. The National Suicide Prevention Hotline is 1-800-273-TALK. TALK on your keypad is 4673. So that's 1-800-273-4673. That's the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. The Samaritans in Massachusetts also has a hotline. That's 1-877-870-4673. Again, the Suicide Prevention Hotline, 800-273-TALK or 1-800-273-4673. And the Samaritan statewide, 1-877-870-4673. We would love to be able to come out and talk to you about suicide prevention and intervention. Remember that suicide intervention and prevention is everyone's job. It's not just for mental health therapists or doctors, so please get engaged. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the Heywood Healthbeat, and my guest is Tim Sweeney. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.